to have the opportunity to work with. Just a couple of sort of notes about the evening. One, this project is part of Limud Michigan, which unfortunately, because of the current situation we're in, did not end up happening, as you all know. So one of the things Limud wanted to try and do is to try and, hang on to some learning as much as possible. And so this is an opportunity for us to do that. Luckily, Zvi Kalman, who is our incredible scholar for this evening, is also advanced with technology and using technology. So he's an extra special person to have with us tonight for that reason. But beyond that, I think just the opportunity to be together in some sort of capacity of Jewish learning is feeling really important right now. So just a couple of things about Zoom, and then I'm actually going to ask Rabbi Rubenstein to say a couple of words on behalf of Limud, and then we'll get right to it with David Zvi. Yes, the first thing I'm going to ask is everyone should mute themselves. Okay, so please push mute on your platforms. I know many of you are using different things, whether it's a computer or an iPad or an iPhone, but there is a mute function, and it's really important when there's so many people on a call that we do our best to stay muted. So please do that. If you look at the bottom of your screen, there is a chat box. It looks like a little circle, and it has 3 dots in it. And you have to hover your mouse over the bottom of the screen for that to come up. And that's an option there for you to ask questions, to kind of raise your hand to say, I would like to ask something. But again, keeping in mind, there are now 55 of us on here. It's going to be hard for us to get everybody in, but we'll do our very, very best. Any other worries or questions, you can type them in the chat box and let me know what I can do to help. I'll be sort of monitoring that so that David Zvi can really focus on his teaching. And welcome. So Rabbi Rubenstein, would you mind giving a couple words of introduction and welcome, and then we'll let David Zvi, I'll introduce him.
Yeah, I'm anxious to do so. Thank you so much. I want to welcome everyone. I'm Stephen Rubenstein here at Limud. Around the world and Limud Michigan, we go by first names, not by titles. We are an independent organization, all volunteer organization here at Limud Michigan, and we are disappointed to have had to postpone our March 22nd event, which was going to be at Eastern Michigan University. But we are very excited for the fall, as November 1st is going to be our event. Hopefully, as much as possible, the same event we were planning for just a little over a week and a half ago. And we're really excited for our regulars and anyone new who would like to be with us to be there November 1st at Eastern Michigan. You do not have to remember this. We will remind you maybe 15, 20, 30, 40 times between now and then. And we are really excited. I'm so glad to see so many of our regular Limud learners online with us tonight. And I really want to thank Zvi Kalman for teaching us this evening, being our teacher. Thank you so much to Rebecca Starr and the Shalom Hartman Institute and Shalom Hartman North America. And I'm just so glad we're able to be together to learn as close as we can at this time here on Zoom. So thanks so much. I'm going to turn it back over to Rebecca, and thanks so much.
Okay, great. Just a quick note of introduction around David Zvi. First, one bit of trivia that you might not know about him, and I don't know if he would say it or not, but he did invent a 20-sided dreidel, which is super cool. But he is also a fellow in residence at the Hartman Institute, and he was also part of the inaugural cohort of the North American David Hartman Center Fellows Group. He received his PhD from the University of Pennsylvania, and he writes on Jewish law, the history of technology, and Islamic jurisprudence. He is also the owner of Print-A-Craft Press and the executive director of Jewish Public Media. He lives in Philadelphia with his wife and children. It is really my honor to welcome him to this forum tonight. And also I have the pleasure of working with him most days. So welcome David Zvi to Limud Michigan. Thanks for coming.
Thanks so much, Rebecca. And thanks, Rabbi Rubenstein. And really thank you everybody for coming to this talk tonight. I You know, as a parent of 3 small children, that time has become very precious in this particular moment. And I really appreciate that you've taken the time out to be part of this class so that we can learn together. I'm going to pause periodically throughout the talk to give you a chance to ask questions based on the things that come up. There's a source sheet for which there's a link in the comments. And so we're going to use that, but I think some people may also have some trouble accessing it or may not be able to pull it up on the screen at the same time as they're watching everyone's beautiful faces. So I'm going to read as much as possible so that you don't necessarily have to be staring at the source sheet at the same time. So the title of the class today is What is Shabbat in the 21st Century? And I want to frame this in a couple ways for you. One is that this is not really just about Shabbat. It's also about holidays. And I think it's particularly relevant for Passover, which is coming up. Many of the questions, many of the issues that get raised around Shabbat come up around Passover and the other holidays as well, because so much of the legal so much of the rules for both of them is similar. I think it's particularly coming up this year because of the social isolation that we're all experiencing. And the question that particularly has come up around the Seder and whether it's possible to have a Zoom Seder where you're communicating with somebody else online, and whether the importance of preserving that human connection, especially for people who are really, really isolated and lonely, and who have the potential for real for a real injury to be caused by the fact that they're so alone, whether that overrides the kind of general uncomfortability and perhaps prohibition on using Zoom, on using electricity, and on all the different layers that are involved in allowing that technology to be available. So I think this is kind of generally important in terms of thinking about 21st century technology, but it also has this particular importance now because technology is really the medium through which so much of our basic communication with our friends and relatives and colleagues is happening. So I hope to keep that in mind, and I think that's an important part of the discussion in thinking about what do we do in situations like this, in situations where technology seems to be informing so much of our lives. I want to start with a story which some of you might be familiar with, but I think it's a helpful place to begin. In the Talmud, there's a story often referred to as the Tanur Shel Achnai, the oven of Achnai. I don't want to go through the entire story now. For some of you, this may be, you've heard it, dozens and dozens of times in your life, but to give you the kind of skeleton of it, there is a story in which the rabbis consider the ritual purity of an oven, whether a specific kind of oven can be made ritually pure or impure. One rabbi, Rabbi Elazar, says it's fine. The other rabbis say, no, you cannot use it. And Rabbi Elazar is particularly adamant that he is correct. He ends up calling on, he ends up kind of creating all these supernatural phenomenon to demonstrate that he is correct, ultimately asking God to call out from heaven, proving him right, at which point the rabbis say, we don't really care, we're right. And the fact that most of the rabbis agree overrides even God's own decree. There's more to the story, and there's many, many, many interpretations about what it means. What I'm interested in for our purposes is the fact that it starts with an oven, which is, in most readings of the story, kind of this afterthought, like who cares what the story is actually about. But I think it's actually important for us for a couple of reasons. One is that it's not entirely an accident that of all the things that the rabbi is going to have this big argument about, it was an oven, and it was about the laws of ritual purity. There are some areas of law that are more susceptible to argumentation than others, and ritual purity used to be one of the major ones in which there was a major possibility of argumentation, because there are so many different kinds of objects in the world, right? People are inventing all kinds of new cups and mugs and ovens and dishwashers, whatever it is, constantly. And every time you have a new object, you can ask about that object. Does this object, is it capable of becoming impure? Which is a question which we don't think about much nowadays, but the rabbis certainly thought about a lot. And so the creation of these new vessels, the fact that there was technological development in this area meant that it was very likely that if the rabbis were going to have this big, important argument about their own authority, it would be instigated by a discussion of an oven in the area of ritual purity. That's an area of law where there really is a lot of exposure to to a technology, but it's now basically defunct, so we don't think about it much anymore. The other major area of Jewish law where technology is constantly bringing us new problems is Shabbat. There is really no end, and there probably never will be an end to conversations around what is and is not allowed on Shabbat, basically because the laws around Shabbat govern every possible action. For every action that a human being can do, you can ask, can you do that on Shabbat, or can you not do that on Shabbat? And every time a technology comes along and creates new possible actions for a person, like say, calling to Alexa or something, or driving a car, or going on Zoom, every time there's a new action created, you can always ask about that action, yes or no. Is it allowed or is it not allowed? And so Shabbat is just really going to constantly, it's kind of on the front lines of Jewish responses to technological development. And I actually have data on this. The main data is, if you look on the second page of the source sheet, there's a graph that I created based on a podcast that I used to produce called Responsa Radio, produced by Yeshivat Hadar, in which every episode is devoted to answering one Jewish legal question. And so I graphed, what are the topics that come up. And the topic that comes up the most frequently is something to do with technology. And the one that comes up second most frequently is Shabbat. So this really happens constantly and is not, and I expect will continue to happen long into the future. The problem with this kind of constant barrage of questions being asked about Shabbat is that it sometimes makes Shabbat law very, very hard to follow, and also leads to situations that strike many of us as being a little bit absurd. And to that, I want you to look back at the first page of the source sheet. This is a book that I found in Mea Sharim in Jerusalem last year, The Illustrated Guide to Opening Packages on Shabbat, or on Shabbos rather, which on its face seems like, oh my God, I both can't believe that there's a book that is specifically about this, and also the laws of Shabbat entirely naturally would make a book like this possible, because there are all kinds of packaging. Technology means that there's more and more kinds of packaging every single year. And so you legitimately could extrapolate from the existing laws of Shabbat to create a book that looks like this. This is both, for some people, very exciting because it's fun to learn new things, but for people who grew up keeping Shabbat and have a sense of all the things you can and cannot do based on their own experience, based on tradition, based on what their parents taught them, books like this can feel very strange and very alienating, because it feels like, why are you making more rules that don't really make sense? Shabbat is already complicated enough. This seems totally arbitrary and totally has nothing to do with what I understand Shabbat to be about, which is about rest and unplugging from the world and some kind of real value that kind of anchors life, and that in normal circumstances would also involve going to a synagogue. So there can be that kind of reaction. So part of what I want to do in this class is to think about how we end up in a situation like this, where you end up with Shabbat law being both very complicated and also feeling kind of arbitrary. And at the same time, how we can imagine Shabbat law developing going forward in a way that actually makes us feel good about the way it's developed so far, and what it might look like, in the next, in the 21st century. The other framing of this that I think is just so delightful is an account that the physicist Richard Feynman gives in his autobiography, in which he describes visiting the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York, and being asked by the students there this question, which to him seemed so insulting almost. And so he writes, this is in source number 1, he says, in the second paragraph, one day, 2 or 3 of the young rabbis came to me and said, we realized that we can't study to be rabbis in the modern world without knowing something about science, so we'd like to ask you some questions. Of course, there were thousands of places to find out about science, and Columbia University was right near there, but I wanted to know what kinds of questions they were interested in. They said, well, for instance, is electricity fire? Which, for those of you who have a sense of Jewish law, know that there is this massive debate in the 20th century around why exactly is it not permissible to flick lights on and off to use electricity. And there is this searching for a source within Shabbat law that makes this prohibited. And one of the rationales is to suggest, well, electricity is a kind of fire. So they're asking one of the most preeminent physicists in America, is that true? Is electricity fire? And so he says, no, but what's the problem? They say, in the Talmud, it says that you're not supposed to make fire on a Saturday. So our question is, can we use electrical things on Saturdays? To which he responds, in the top of the second page, I was shocked. They weren't interested in science at all. The only way science was influencing their lives was so that they might be able to interpret better the Talmud. They weren't interested in the world outside and natural phenomena. They were only interested in resolving some question brought up in the Talmud. So there is that disconnect also that I hope that we can avoid, a kind of disconnect between our scientific understanding of the world and our legal understanding of the world. And I hope we can resolve that. I'm going to pause there for a second and ask if there's any questions just about that before we go on. So if you have a question, you should unmute yourself first. All right, I'll keep going. And if there's any questions, feel free to ask them or save them for the next time we pause. I think the way to start to resolve this question is to think about the extremely long journey that the laws of Shabbat have gone through, right? The thing that I focus on in my academic studies is the relationship between Jewish history and the history of technology. And while those two things are not normally put in relationship to each other, Jews have had a kind of ringside seat to basically every major technological development, and many of those developments ended up imprinting themselves in some way on Jewish law. And I think that's especially true for Shabbat because, as I said before, it's really on the front lines of any kind of response to technology. But let's just begin with what Shabbat is supposed to be. So for that, there's nowhere better to start than the way that Shabbat is described in the Ten Commandments. Right? So in Exodus, in source number 3, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the 7th is a Sabbath for Hashem, your God. Do not do any manner of work, neither you, nor your son, daughter, male servant, female servant, animal, nor the stranger in your gates. So this is relatively straightforward. And what this law does is it basically divides up action into work and non-work. Now, the obvious question is, well, how do you decide what work is? And I think while this is being written, right, while you're living in an agricultural society, work is not a very complicated concept to understand, right? Work is not easy, right? Work is not typing at a computer. It's kind of physically quite strenuous. And so you are very aware of when you are working and when you are not working. And that's true, I think, both if you're involved in agriculture and also if you're involved in domestic labor inside the house. In both situations, these things are very clear. And in the Torah, in the Chumash, the examples that are given of people violating the rules around Shabbat labor are people who are gathering food, or they're kindling fires, or they're chopping wood, things that are very, very physical, where there wouldn't be any kind of confusion. And the Torah doesn't really expand very much on exactly what it means by work, I think, because it understands that this is not something that actually needs a lot of explanation. The other thing that I want you to notice here in the list of who is specifically not supposed to be working is that this lists people, and it lists servants or slaves, it lists children, and it lists animals, but it does not list machines. And the reason it does not list machines is because there are no machines to list. In the history of the human development of energy, this is a period in which if you want to move an object, you want to get work done, you either get it done through your muscles or through an animal's muscles. Perhaps aided a little bit by, a pulley here, a trebuchet there, but it's basically about muscle power. And so because of that, there is this, to us seems a kind of giant lacuna, which is this does not tell us what to do about machine labor. This, we will see, quickly becomes a problem, and it's a problem that the rabbis actually have never systematically solved. and have never thought about a way of dealing with. So kind of with that as a base, let's move forward a few hundred years. We're now looking at the period of the rabbis. The rabbis are approaching these texts, and they're approaching the notion of what is Shabbat and what does it mean to work on Shabbat, but they're living in a different kind of economy, right? They're not living in an economy which is primarily agricultural. They're living in an economy which now involves a lot more trade, a lot more artisanal work, and a lot more manufacturing. And they are attempting, in that context, to understand how this very vague notion of work that the rabbis, that the Torah describes, is supposed to fit in with their lives. I should say that this is not like a kind of quick transition. Later books of the Bible, including Amos in source number 4, are already thinking about not just planting or gathering wood, but they're also thinking about Shabbat as a day that people are engaging in commerce, and they are. And Amos is upset that people are engaging in commerce. So there's a kind of transition process. But when we get to the rabbis, we're certainly thinking about a world in which the primary concern is no longer just about agriculture. It is now about the manufacturing sector as well. And the manufacturing sector is a lot more complicated. There's many more kinds of things that you need to classify as work in order to preserve this notion that work should not be allowed on Shabbat. And so the rabbis undertake a project which to us seems kind of technical, and I want to kind of flag as actually being heroic. Law is hard to write. For those of you who are computer programmers, I think there's a kind of analogy here where in both the creation of law and the creation of code, you're attempting to actually describe a set of very complicated behaviors in the real world using just a few words. And that requires a lot of creativity and it requires a lot of ambition to actually accomplish this task. And so what the rabbis end up with is a kind of now famous list of 39 different things, 39 different actions that a person is not allowed to do on Shabbat. And this is their way of kind of exploding that simple notion of don't do work, don't light fires, into this much larger notion of work as they understand it. So their response is really to put their creative efforts in here. I want to flag this as worth thinking about, not just for the rabbinic context, but also for our context as well. We are all confronting in various ways, how does a given technology affect our relationship with Judaism? How does it engage, how does it fit into Jewish law? And I think there's often a kind of immediate reaction of kind of giving a yes or no, like, it does fit in, it doesn't fit in, or it fits in, but we should be cautious, and here are some things we should think about. I think what the rabbis actually suggest in passages like this is that when you're confronted with new technologies, the response actually has to involve great creativity in thinking about the ways in which it does or does not fit in. So thinking, for example, about the internet, right? There's all kinds of behaviors that people can engage with on the internet. Some of them we probably think are good, some of them we think are bad. But because the internet is this giant place, there's often this tendency to say, well, I can't really, what can I do? Can I just tell people not to use the internet? That won't work. There's a few Jewish communities that do that, but most do not. What it really requires is kind of parsing through very carefully, like all the various kinds of actions that a person can perform online, which are acceptable, which are not acceptable. That's like a real job. That's a hard job to do. And it's the kind of job that the rabbis are engaged with in source number 5 when they're imagining when they're listing all the 39 different things that you're not allowed to do on Shabbat. And so they list here, I'm just going to read it quickly for those who aren't familiar with it, who can't read who don't have the sources in front of them. In source number 5, they say, the primary labors are 40 less 1, 39. Sowing, plowing, reaping, binding sheaves, threshing, winnowing, selecting, grinding, sifting, kneading, baking, shearing wool, bleaching, hackling, dyeing, spinning, weaving, the making of 2 loops, weaving 2 threads, dividing 2 threads, tying and untying, sewing 2 stitches, tearing in order to sew 2 stitches, capturing a deer, slaughtering, flaying, salting, curing its hide, scraping it of its hairs, cutting it up, writing 2 letters, erasing in order to write 2 letters over the erasure, building, tearing down, extinguishing, kindling, striking with a hammer, and carrying out from one domain to another. These are the 40 primary labors less 1. It's a fun exercise that maybe you can do after this class to think about if you were tasked with the same thing, if you were tasked with trying to delimit work, the things that are and are not allowed on Shabbat, to kind of create a definition of work, and you have 39 categories to do it with, what would you put in those categories? What kinds of actions would you put? And it's actually quite hard to do, in part because, saying something like, typing is not allowed doesn't really work because typing has so many different uses. One thing that the rabbis have on their side is that because we're talking about a manufacturing sector, most work is still done with people's hands. You can say, here's a physical action that you can perform, right? Waving a hammer, right? Ripping something up. And so in that way, it's easy to point to something and say, that's a thing that's prohibited. Because it's really just about those physical actions. There's something visceral about these laws that help make it clear, that help make it easier to understand, and help make this at least a somewhat finite areas of law, even though in the Talmud, each and every one of these categories ends up being expanded and expanded and expanded into many, many, many more different things that are and are not allowed on Shabbat. The other thing to say about this is that the rabbis are aware in this process that the thing that they are doing is kind of like totally brazen and really gutsy. And they say this in source number 7. They describe how all of these rules that they've invented, this massive creative project that they've invented, is really hanging on almost nothing in the text itself. In source number 7, in the Tosefta and Eruvin, this is probably a 3rd century text, we don't know exactly when. It says, the laws of Shabbat, festivals, and sacrilege are like mounts or mountains hanging by a thread. There is little scripture and many laws. They have nothing to rely on. On this, Rabbi Yoshua says, tongs are made from tongs. How were the first tongs made? Are they not a divine creation? And that last line, there's a lot to unpack there, but I think basically what they're saying in that reference to tongs and in blacksmithing is that the rabbis understand themselves as basically being smiths. But the thing that they work is not metal or wood, but it's Torah. And that what it means to be a rabbi is to kind of shape Torah in the way that a carpenter would shape wood, or in the way that a blacksmith would shape metal. And they have shaped the laws of Shabbat in such a way that they've really expanded it out into these massive categories. So that's one shift that happens from the Torah to the rabbinic period because of this technological shift and because of the shift into the manufacturing sector. The second shift goes back to the absence of any directive about machines in the biblical text. The first major machine that people harness to do work for them is the watermill. And if you talk to historians of technology, there are some who claim that you can really trace the Industrial Revolution itself back to the development of the watermill, which happens probably sometime around the 3rd century BCE. We don't know exactly where, but this is really the first device that comes along where you have a wheel that's turning in a moving stream, and the stream moves the wheel, and the wheel does some kind of work for you. Normally, at least initially, it's grinding grain. Eventually, it's expanded to all kinds of other activities. This is really the first device that the rabbis need to grapple with, and actually one of the earliest sources, period, that attests to the existence of watermills is the Mishnah, is the Tosefta, around the 3rd century. And it writes in the Tosefta, this is source number 9, there is a discussion of things that are and are not allowed on Shabbat. Basically, are there activities that you can set in motion before Shabbat, and then that process will happen on Shabbat without your work, without your help. In source number 9, there's a number of circumstances put forward, and the watermill is one of them. So to read source number 9, it says, one may aim water toward a garden, which will go and water the garden on Friday when it is almost dark. One may put a collyrium salve, some kind of medication, on the eye, or a healing compress on a wound on Friday when it is almost dark, even though they will provide healing continuously throughout Shabbat. One may put sulfur beneath silver vessels on Friday when it is almost dark, even though they will darken through sulfuring on Shabbat. One may put perfume upon coals on Friday when it is almost dark. But one may not put wheat in a watermill unless it is for the purpose of grinding. That will be completed on Shabbat. So this is really, this is a ruling that's given, but it's not explained exactly why this is the case, why it is that putting things in a water mill is different from all those other kinds of activities where you set something in motion before Shabbat and then work is done for you on Shabbat. And because it is left unexplained, the Talmud goes ahead and tries to explain it. And they come up with two different explanations. One of them is more systematic, and the second is more specific to water mills. The more systematic explanation is to say, well, just like people can't work and machines can't, people can't work and your family can't work and your animals can't work, machines can't work either. And this is just one more thing that cannot work. And they basically put machines in this category as a kind of labor that is also disallowed because they understand the machine is kind of a labor performing object, labor performing device. And so they can just rule it out. This opinion, which is put forward by Beit Shammai, is actually rejected. And instead, the position that's accepted in source number 10, in the very first line, is they say, why? Why is this not allowed? Rabbi said, because it makes noise. And that's it, because water mills are loud. And the fact that they're loud is what means that you can't use them. It has nothing to do with any underlying notion of work being done or who is ultimately responsible for this labor. It's really just about the experience of being in an environment where there are water mills running on Shabbat. Because, I mean, this is actually true, water mills are very loud. The rabbis are not the only ones to point this out. There are many medieval sources which also describe water mills as being very loud. And if you're in an environment where you don't have heavy industry yet, and things are generally pretty quiet, even when there's a lot of work being done, you could imagine that even the lowly water mill might actually change the atmosphere of a day. And so the rabbis kind of dodge this question. They don't provide a general solution for things that are and are not allowed on, for machines that are and are not allowed on Shabbat. Instead, they just say, it's about the feeling of it. It's about the atmosphere that it creates or does not create. So this, on the one hand, is not helpful because it doesn't tell us going forward what to do with other kinds of machines. But it also is useful because it gives us a sense that there is something we're trying to preserve here. And we'll see a little bit later that that notion that the rabbis have an innate sense of what Shabbat is supposed to be like really drives a lot of the way that Shabbat develops. Let me pause there again and ask if there's any questions based on everything.
David, see, there was one question posted in the chat that I sent to you.
Oh, about the Shabbat goy.
Yeah.
The Shabbos goy. So this, it's funny. In the 19th century and in the 20th century, there's an odd thing that happens in that there's a lot of very complex mechanical systems like the telegraph and the telegram, which involve Gentiles, and those Gentiles end up being kind of treated as being irrelevant, as being kind of one and the same as the technological system. So in some ways, actually, there are ways in which the Shabbos goy and these machines are in the same category in that they are ways of getting work done, perhaps in a way that is acceptable. So they are. I think the comparison is useful. The law is certainly not exactly the same, in part because communicating with another person involves telling them to do something or not telling them to do something, and there's all kinds of rules around how exactly it is acceptable to tell a Gentile to do work for you on Shabbat, whereas a machine, doesn't have intention, doesn't have things that it itself wants, so it's different in that way. But they are both devices for kind of dealing with this problem of trying to get things done in Shabbat when you yourself do not feel comfortable doing them.
And then another question from Yafa. She's going to unmute herself and ask.
Okay. Hi. My question is, what about air conditioners and heaters that are working throughout Shabbat? And obviously, if you open the door and close it and the thermostat goes up and down by itself, isn't that the same as a machine working?
They certainly are. And if the Talmud had decided that machines can't work on Shabbat, that might have been a problem. Because the Talmud actually dodges the question and says, no, it's about noise, we can end up in situations where some rabbis will say, actually, those things are fine. It's totally fine to use heat or cooling on Shabbat. There are some rabbis, I think especially Sephardic rabbis tend to be more lenient on these issues, which will say, you can set your dishwasher to run a cycle on Shabbat, and you load up the dishes on Friday night after you have your dinner, and then close the dishwasher, and then it'll get done on Shabbat. So I guess what I'm trying to say is there isn't a systemic response to this, which kind of begs the question of, well, then what exactly decides which activities are and are not allowed? Who makes that decision? And is there kind of a rhyme or reason behind it? Another question, how do the rabbis address the issue that some categories determined to be work involve actions that are actually necessary for living? So I think, again, this is an issue that the rabbis do not have to confront so much, although they are certainly aware that there are times in which the rules of Shabbat have to be abrogated for the sake of saving a life. The notion of pikuach nefesh is very important in Jewish law, that many areas of Jewish law can be temporarily lifted for the purpose of saving lives. And so they are aware that that happens sometimes. They also are aware that there are circumstances in which you kind of need to make further divisions that they haven't already made. So for example, one of the rules around Shabbat is you're not allowed to grind things, right? Grinding for grain is a major industrial process, but is that the same as grinding up some pepper to use when you're seasoning your food if a plate's in front of you? So there are some attempts to kind of divide those two things up, where the industrial activity is not permitted, whereas the kind of personal domestic activity is permitted. Any more questions? So we're going to take another jump. We're going to jump from the rabbis in the Talmud to the medieval period and try to think through again how Shabbat is thought about, right? So far, the ways we've thought about Shabbat are almost entirely negative, right? Don't do work. And many descriptions of what work means. But that doesn't actually tell you very much about what Shabbat is supposed to be like, what you are supposed to do, beyond perhaps going to shul. Beyond that, there is really very little described, and there's not as much attention given to the things that one is supposed to do. And one of the things that is revealed in some medieval sources is that there are actually significant disagreements about what Shabbat is supposed to be for, assuming that you are not doing any work. And those disagreements, I think some of them probably resonate today. I want you to look at source number 11. This is on page number 5. This is by the Trumat Hadeshen, a German source from the 14th century, Rabbi Isserlein. And he describes some behaviors which may or may not be familiar about Shabbat. He says, it is forbidden to speak as excessively as one does during the week on Shabbat, right? Who would have thought, right? Part of Shabbat is not talking so much. All the more so to do so more than one does during the week. Nonetheless, if people enjoy speaking, see, there's already a caveat. He understands this is complicated. If people enjoy speaking and telling tales about kings and princes and their wars, as many people love to do, it seems it is certainly permissible. For Rabbi Yitzchak of Corbet wrote similarly that young men who get pleasure from running and jumping are allowed to do so. Similarly, it is permissible to watch anything that one gets pleasure from watching. We see from here that even though the sages derived from verses that one should not run and jump, it is nonetheless permissible to do so if it is for pleasure and fulfillment of desire, right? So I think this already gets at the kind of complexity of this issue. Well, you shouldn't talk so much, but if you like it, then maybe that's okay. You shouldn't be running and jumping, but if that's part of what Shabbat means to you, then maybe that's okay. And you see there's a kind of flexibility around what you should do on Shabbat in ways that aren't exactly matched on the kind of negative side and the side of things you're not allowed to do, where there are these huge volumes of very rigid law. Part of this, I imagine, is that what it means to keep Shabbat is very, very subjective, right? If you think about what it means for you to have a rest period, your notion of what rest is may not be similar to what someone else's notion of what rest is, right? Maybe you rest by, doing a crossword puzzle, or for someone else, that's torture. there's all kinds of leisure activity. There's all kinds of recreational activity, which are viewed very differently by different people. Sometimes it is also connected to the things that you do for work, right? If you are a blacksmith in your day job, you probably don't want to do blacksmithing, you know, in your shed on the weekends. But maybe you're someone who works in a totally different field. Maybe you're a lawyer. And on the weekends, you like to get out your creative energies by having a woodworking shop, something like that. That ends up being very complicated, right? Those notions of what it means to relax are directly connected to what it means to work. And there's only so much that the rabbis can do within the existing very complicated framework of Shabbat law, but they understand that these two things are connected. The rabbi who I think gets at this most clearly is Rabbi Menachem Meiri, writing a little bit after Trumat Hadeshen, but they're rough contemporaries. And he writes in source number 12, the obligation of Shabbat delight, Oneg Shabbat, is very great. Its substance is according to a person's finances and according to what is normal on weekdays. Thus, they say, even a small thing done in honor of Shabbat, they have fulfilled the obligation of Shabbat delight. The general principle is, it is better to make your Shabbat like a weekday than to be dependent on others for one's Shabbat meals. In the Talmud Yerushalmi, they said, how does one make it a pleasure? How does one make Shabbat a pleasure? One said with sleep, another said with Torah study. Right? That's a pretty significant disagreement, right? Is Shabbat for sleeping? There is no argument. One is in reference to a Torah scholar, the other to a worker. But even within that dichotomy, there's a disagreement about, well, which one is rest for which of those two? My teachers explain that a scholar delights in Torah study and a worker in sleep, but I say the opposite. A teacher who studies the entire week on Shabbat observes the delight of sleep so that his mind is not weary too much. But for a worker who is busy with his affairs during the week, it is fitting for him to busy himself a little on Shabbat with Torah as a delight. I'm reminded in this of the story, perhaps apocryphal, told about Robert Frost, the poet, who once was at a dinner, and after the dinner, you know, all the dinner guests went out onto the balcony, and it was around sunset, and a woman says to him, "Oh, Mr. Frost, isn't that a lovely sunset?" And he says, "You know, I never talk business after dinner." Because for him, this is work. So it's really, really very, very subjective. And the rabbis are trying to grapple with that subjectivity. Let me stop again and ask if there are any questions about that segment. You can either ask out loud or put it in the chat box.
Okay, so this is Clara, and I'm just curious if doesn't the notion of subjectivity actually complicate things to the point where there's a reversal, and you get to the Shulchan Aruch, and there's a lot of limitations placed because at a certain point, too much subjectivity starts to chip away at the notion of the holiness of Shabbat and what it actually means to keep Shabbat.
So I think that's definitely a concern. And I think that the rabbis are concerned that people are not just doing whatever it is on Shabbat, that there is still some sense of community on that day. So I think it's a kind of balancing act to, on the one hand, make sure that there are real standards, universal standards around the day, but also account for the fact that people actually do vary in what they want to do on this, you know, on the seventh day of the week. So we're going to skip forward in time one more time, getting almost to today, not quite to today. If we understand that the first shift in what Shabbat means takes place with the shift from an agricultural society to a manufacturing society, or even, you know, in the medieval period, not just manufacturing, but also a service economy. There's certainly a lot of Jews who are actually not allowed to be involved in manufacturing and are kind of pushed into the finance sector because that's really the only way in which they can earn a living. So imagining that as one important transition point, I think the second really key transition point is the Industrial Revolution, right? The Industrial Revolution overturns all kinds of patterns in human labor, standards about what it means to work, how often one should work, the kind of work that one does, how stressful it is, how much training one needs to do it. And this, you know, there's been oodles of books certainly written about this. One of the things that this changes, and I think this is true both in Shabbat law and also in the Christian understanding of the Sabbath, is what it means to have a day of rest. And there starts to be a conversation, and this is a really hotly debated conversation in America around the Christian Sabbath, around whether the day of rest is supposed to be a day when you're really doing very little, maybe learning with your family, maybe reading, maybe going to church, but really that's about it. Or if it is a day of recreation, whether it's a day you should be going to baseball games, or whether you should be shopping, or whether you should be going on long trips. There are all kinds of debates about which way you should go. You know, the blue laws that exist in some states are kind of remnant of this, but in the late 19th century, as streetcars are coming in, there are debates. There are many cities where there's arguments about whether it's permissible to have streetcars on Sundays. Eventually, the Supreme Court allows streetcars on Sundays on the grounds of interstate commerce, because often you need streetcars to go from one train system to another train system, so you can't just shut them down on Sundays. But this is a real debate, and there's many, many cities which for years have laws in the books around having no streetcars on Sundays, in the same way that, you know, Israel today has rules around transportation on Shabbat, understanding that enabling people to move great distances will inevitably mean that the character of the day changes, and they may also not go to church, may not go to a synagogue. I gave you a couple of graphics, one from the 19th century, one from the 20th century, that kind of express this tension. So on page 6, this is from a committee which is there for the sole purpose of promoting the old notion of the Sabbath as a day of rest and not a day of recreation. This is from the bulletin of the New York Sabbath Committee. And in the picture, there is a couple of people standing under a tree. The tree is labeled Sabbath rest. There's a person with an axe standing by the tree with labor written on him. And the caption is, "Don't kill the tree that shades you. You would be a fool to destroy this thing by overrunning it with labor, by working in the factories 7 days a week, and not just and not actually taking a pause." I think what this also points to is one of the things that happens as a result of the shift to major industry is that you start to have factories which really don't need to shut down ever. And in some situations, in many situations, they'd prefer not to shut down. They'd prefer to be running 24/7, certainly after electric lighting comes in. There's no reason for many, many factories to shut down. Employers would love for people to be there as often as they can. And so there's this shift in what it means to labor, from labor being something which you're either doing or you're not doing. And when you're not doing it, because it's basically just you as an individual, you're either working in your wood shop or you're not. It's very easy to flip that switch between working and not working. With the Industrial Revolution, the paradigm of what it means to work changes, and that work is something that is basically constant. Work, by default, never stops, which is, this is so obvious for us today that work never stops that we don't even think about it so much anymore, right? You can tune out for a while, you can decide not to check your email for a while, but it's not like work goes away. There's always somebody working somewhere around the globe, in your community. So in that way, there is this shift to an understanding of trying to limit work, when to not work is not just about saying, I'm putting down my tools, I'm going to have a day of rest, but it's also a decision to kind of remove yourself from the economy for a short amount of time, to kind of put yourself in a different space, to leave a stream and then enter that stream again. This is really where we start having the notion of unplugging. Now, the notion of that Shabbat is a day of unplugging obviously is not something that the rabbis use. I think I haven't looked into exactly where it comes from initially, but it's quite new. I think it's probably in the last 20 years or so that people talk about Shabbat as a day of unplugging. But even before that language of Shabbat as a day of unplugging, I think that notion really comes in with the Industrial Revolution, and with this idea that to observe Shabbat is to consciously choose to take oneself out of out of the labor pool for that day. The other element of what it means to keep Shabbat in these settings is that work, especially in the American context, is not value neutral. Right? In the 19th century, America, as this growing country, understands work not just as something you do to get along, to put food on the table, but as a kind of symbol of progress. And this notion that work is connected to American progress is really deeply embedded in the American psyche. And so to stop working is also in some ways to resist an American project. And the person who captures this the most is Abraham Joshua Heschel in his book, The Sabbath. And when he's writing about what it means to observe the Sabbath, he is both obviously writing in these beautiful, eloquent terms about the day, but he's also really responding to a particular kind of American Sabbath. And it's a kind of American Sabbath that honestly, I think, speaks both to Jews and also speaks to Christians, many of whom would sympathize with the way that he understands what it means to keep an American Sabbath. So he says in source number 13, to set apart one day a week for freedom, a day on which we would not use the instruments which have been so easily turned into weapons of destruction, a day for being with ourselves, a day of detachment from the vulgar, of independence of external obligations, a day on which we stop worshiping the idols of technical civilization, a day on which we use no money, a day of armistice in the economic struggle with our fellow men and the forces of nature. Is there any institution that holds out a greater hope for man's progress than the Sabbath? In regard to external gifts, to outward possessions, there is only one proper attitude: to have them and to be able to do without them. On the Sabbath, we live, as it were, independent of technical civilization. We abstain primarily from any activity that aims at remaking or reshaping the things of space. Man's royal privilege to conquer nature is suspended on the seventh day. What are the kinds of labor not to be done on the Sabbath? They are, according to the ancient rabbis, all those acts which were necessary for the construction and furnishing of the sanctuary in the desert. The Sabbath itself is a sanctuary which we build, a sanctuary in time. So there's something really fascinating happening in this text, right? If we think about Shabbat as being a kind of negative construction, it's about the things that you can't do, the meaning of that negative construction both expands over time and also becomes much, much grander. It starts out as basically this very simple idea of you should rest one day a week, but by the time we get to Heschel, it's not just about rest, it's about an attitude towards civilization itself. And that comes about because in the same way that what it means to keep Shabbat depends on what you do during the week, the meaning of Shabbat itself, of what it means to keep Shabbat, is in direct conversation with the way that the civilization around you understands itself, and especially the way that the civilization around you understands work. And so Heschel deeply recognizes this. I think he's writing this very this incredible text that is really responding to that moment. Now, this kind of brings us to back to the beginning. The question of, well, okay, Shabbat is about resisting civilization. Okay, Shabbat varies depending on who you are, what you do. But what do you do with books like all the different ways you can and cannot open packages on Shabbat? All of that arcana that seems still kind of disconnected and small and kind of arbitrary, especially in comparison to the grand vision that Heschel has described. And there really is this like really serious division between the extremely, extremely technical nature of Shabbat on the one hand, and this very grand perspective that many philosophical books, or many theological texts about Shabbat are describing. And also, I think this is especially showed up a lot in the last decade or so. There's many books written not specifically for Jewish audiences, which recommend Shabbat as a kind of good practice to have, especially in the world of smartphones, as a day to spend away from your smartphone, a day of disconnecting, recognizing that there is a kind of philosophy embedded in this, a philosophy that in those books is often projected 2,000 years into the past, when of course that wouldn't make sense. So how do you kind of square those two things? How do you kind of put on the one hand this giant philosophy in conversation with these extremely technical rules? To answer this, I want to take you to a kind of strange place, which is to the Amish. The reason I want to look at the Amish is because I think that there's something going on in the way that Amish communities understand technology, which actually bears a striking resemblance to what Jews do in terms of Shabbat. Now, you know, because of their the way in which they use email and the internet and all kinds of electronic devices, I think people often have a vague sense of Amish as being kind of anti-technology, but not beyond that, not much beyond that. In the last few months, it's kind of been cut short by the outbreak. I've been trying to do research on the Amish community around where I live. I live in Philadelphia, so in Lancaster County, where there's a large Amish population. Speaking to researchers there, also speaking to people within the Amish community itself about how they understand their rules and regulations. Now, the Amish rules and regulations are not written down. They're kind of preserved orally. So that's a kind of major difference between what the Amish do and what Jews do. But there is a kind of similarity in that many of the regulations seem from the outside to not make so much sense. So for example, many Amish do not use electricity in their homes. But if they're at work and the work is owned by someone who is not Amish, they're totally fine with it. Many Amish people will not have telephones in their homes. But if the phone is outside their home, if it's in like a separate, outbuilding, that's totally fine. Many people in the Amish community will not use computers in their homes, but will use them in the course of work. Or they'll use a car as long as the car is not actually owned by them, that the title is held by somebody else. When I visited a person in Lancaster County, one thing that I noticed, which was described to me, is that in the last few years, there has been a widespread adoption in Lancaster County of the use of LED lighting internally. So, many Amish houses are not wired up to the grid, and previously they had used gas lighting, but many houses now use LED lighting, with the reason being that LED lighting is, you can have an LED lighting without being connected to the grid. That like kind of being connected to the grid itself is a kind of problem, being connected to outside civilization, but because the LEDs run on batteries, that's fine. And that use of batteries as opposed to the grid is a kind of a frequent workaround. So for example, you might have a schoolhouse which has a photocopier, but that photocopier has been modified so that it's connected to a battery and not to a power outlet. You have many of these different situations. So like on the outside, it seems kind of, the one attitude you can have towards all of this is to say like, this is so stupid. Like, these are just silly gimmicks to get something that, you could have had just by getting it the normal way. Why go through all this rigmarole? But I think from the perspective of people who observe Shabbat, some of these behaviors are actually extremely familiar, right? Like the notion that there is something small you do in your behavior around a device on Shabbat that signals that Shabbat is different, right? So for example, pushing an elevator button with a different finger, or having a light on Shabbat that, it's a Shabbos lamp where it technically doesn't turn off, you just open and close a shade in order to extinguish it. Or as we talked about before, asking a Gentile to do the work for you, which is a strategy, again, that Amish use frequently by employing non-Amish people to do work or to be in their places of business in order to use modern technologies. There's a way to look at these workarounds and say, like, this is so silly, but I think there is a kind of deep logic to it, and the logic comes now not out of the law itself, but out of an internalized understanding that comes about through many, many years of Shabbat observance of what Shabbat is supposed to feel like. And that is a very complicated notion. It's very complicated to convey. But I think once people have that sense of what Shabbat is supposed to feel like, it becomes clear that there's certain kinds of activities which will break into that notion of what Shabbat is supposed to feel like, and certain ones which will not. So for example, having a lamp which is clearly a weird lamp because like it doesn't actually turn off, and you just have a shade that opens and closes, doesn't break that for many people, doesn't break that notion of Shabbat for many people, because it seems weird enough. It signals in its weirdness that it is different and that you are still on a special day. I think this is also the reason that many people are resistant to the use of smartphones on Shabbat, and also resistant even in the current situation to the use of Zoom around the Seder, out of a sense that there is something in turning on that device that really breaks into Shabbat in a way that we are not comfortable with. I think the way that the Amish think about this division is useful for us to consider as well. What I've given you in source number 14 is a scholarly summary of factors that Amish communities consider when deciding whether to use or not use a technology. And I should say, by the way, that the Amish, like Jews around Shabbat, don't just have one rule around this, right? There's many, many Amish communities. Some are more liberal, some are more conservative. And so there's, for any piece of technology, there's always gonna be a range of positions around whether it is or is not allowable on, in daily life, which is also true for many modern technologies, right? There's like a range of positions around, for example, whether you can use a Fitbit or some kind of fitness tracker on Shabbat, right? Some people will, some people won't. There's all kinds of those divisions. What I think is useful is not necessarily to say there is one way of approaching this for all Jews or all Amish people, but that there is a kind of conversation around, around the device. So on page 8, just want to look at the 5 bullet points at the bottom. These are the factors that are described. So one thing to consider is economic impact. New technologies related to making a living are more acceptable than those involving pleasure, convenience, or leisure. Thus, a motor on a hay mower in the field is more acceptable than one on a lawnmower. Visibility. Invisible changes are more acceptable than visible ones. Using fiberglass in the construction of buggies is easier to introduce than changing the external color of the carriage itself. Relating to the Ordnung, this is the oral law. New items that overturn existing Ordnung are more difficult than those that are free from previous rules or that can be grafted onto present regulations. Because it is new technology, accepting a string trimmer may be easier than accepting a push power mower that has been forbidden for 40 years. I think we have this around Shabbat as well. I think, for example, turning on and off lights is actually one of these. Meaning, in the grand scheme of things, turning on and off lights, probably does not, in other contexts, change for us what kind of day this is, right? It's a relatively minor task. But because over time, that simple action has been associated with one of the core things that you're not supposed to do on Shabbat, even though, a la Richard Feynman, it's not actually so clear that, it should be not allowed in the first place. That itself has a kind of power. In the Amish community, I think, driving cars is one of these, these things that really has stuck around because of its longevity. 4, symbolic ties. Changes unrelated to key emblems of ethnic identity, horse, buggy, dress, are more acceptable than the ones that threaten sacred symbols. Likewise, changes linked to negative worldly markers are less acceptable than those without such ties. A word processor with a small screen, for example, would likely be more acceptable than a computer with a large monitor resembling a television. And finally, external connections. Technologies that open avenues of influence from mainstream culture and outsiders are less acceptable than the ones that do not. So one of the major reasons that the Amish decided not to ban connection to the electrical grid is because once you have a house that's wired up for electricity, you can then just plug in any device, and then you don't get to decide whether microwaves specifically are allowed or refrigerators specifically are allowed. You're basically giving carte blanche for all of those things to enter your house, whereas if you rely on batteries, you get to make individual choices. And so preserving that choice, that ability to choose is really important, and not just licensing platforms as a whole. I think, the Jewish, but I think in various ways, all of these factors play into how we decide what is or is not allowed on Shabbat in various communities. And so what I want to put forward for you is that there is in the Jewish Shabbat a way of thinking about technology that is very similar to the way that many Amish communities think about technology. And another way to kind of put a name to that is that both of them are skeptical. Not that they are totally resistant, but that they are skeptical. And that skepticism, I would argue, is actually a really important thing and in quite short supply today. American society today is pretty open to new technologies. There's all kinds of new technologies which we adopt in a kind of na'aseh v'nishma matter. Like, we adopted and then, 2 years down the line, we decide, oh, was that a good idea? Like, should we have given Facebook all our data? Should we have, automatic face detection? That's probably not the best way to go about things. There are other societies that are kind of tech neutral. They allow new technologies, they don't actively encourage them, but they don't resist them when they come in. A kind of tech skepticism or a kind of tech negativity is a useful tool because it means that Shabbat is one of the very few places in American life where people on a regular basis get to approach each and every single new technology and say, is this good? And they get to say that not after it has shown itself to be bad, not after it's shown itself to be problematic, but the default is to question it. And the default is to say, maybe this is not a good idea. And then perhaps with some modifications, you allow it in. But that ability, that kind of instinct to question is something which I think is important to preserve and something which going forward in the 21st century is probably going to be increasingly important. What it means basically is that Shabbat may end up being a kind of foil for society as a whole. If American society as a whole is just moving forward with whatever technologies, whether or not they're actually good, Shabbat is a kind of nature preserve inside of that, in which you get to think about, well, what would the world look like if people didn't have smartphones on them for 24 hours a day? And you can think about, well, what does that do to your brain? What does that do to your life? What does that do to the way that you interact with your family, with your neighbors? There will undoubtedly be more kinds of technologies which are widely adopted in American society and in which Shabbat resists. And it gives us that really rare and really very useful window into thinking about whether those technologies are good or not, and to give us an experience, like a real lived experience of what it would be to not use them. I think this activity, on the one hand, is a little bit scary. It involves a lot of decision making, and I think the pace of technological change, on the one hand, can make people feel very powerless by the changes that are happening around them. I think both the scale of technological development and also the pace of technological development both often feel overwhelming, and so a person might end up feeling like, the technology is going to happen whether I like it or not. I can't really do anything about it, and they may also feel like, on a legislative level, that Congress or whatever other government outside the United States is not actually able to contain those technologies either, right? Is not actually able to regulate technologies. I want to put forward that in between the kind of personal regulation of technology and national regulation of technology, there's a third really, really powerful way of regulating technology. And that is regulating technology on a communal level, on a religious communal level specifically. That religious communities actually have an ability to think about how they want technology to play out in their own community in ways that feel a lot less lonely than if a person by themselves decides, I'm going to refrain from using X technology, X app, whatever it happens to be. That it allows them to experiment with different modes of engagement with technology in ways that, and that I think can ultimately be incredibly useful. So I think this is really exciting. I think it's going to involve a lot of experimentation to think about how to do Shabbat in the future. And I think that different communities will come up with very different responses. But I think that this is something that you should be excited about as well. And I think you should be excited about it is because while the Jewish Shabbat is certainly not something that most Americans observe, we have within Judaism a kind of petri dish for another kind of life, another kind of existence. And it's something that we can explore, and it's really a grounds for creativity. And so I think, well, on the one hand, it can be, frightening to think about all the ways in which new technologies are invading our lives. Shabbat, I think, can be a real restful place and really this amazing place of creation. So I'm going to stop there. And then I'm happy to take any questions that you have about anything that I've said.
I think Rabbi Rubenstein has a question. Stephen?
Yeah, thanks so much. David Zvi, thank you so much for the presentation. I had two, I don't know if they're questions so much as just things that I was noticing, especially about the end of the presentation and the contrast with the Amish. You know, I'm not sure that I see Jewish community as skeptical, nearly as skeptical, because as the Amish, because we've got 6 days to incorporate things, and I think we do in a very high degree. Yeah, for most American Jews anyway, as opposed, and then we have 1 day off. I'm a big fan of the National Day of Unplugging, and I feel like it's a really good example of a way, as you just said at the end, that can be a little bit of a petri dish, and not only do that ourselves, but also sort of spread that out beyond the Jewish community. So I really like that. Just one other thing, one of the other contrasts I think I see is that, at least the way that text you gave us about the Amish community, it's the decision to adopt technology is individual. You were talking about early, or it talks about early adopters, whereas I feel like maybe more now than in the past, but it seems to me that communities did that. You know, if you're living in a community for most of Jewish history, a lot of these things were a question to the rabbi of the community, who hopefully balancing the needs and the wants of his community is making decisions along with them. But it feels like a lot more centralized than just early adopters picking that up and just deciding. I don't know, maybe just looking for reactions to that. Thanks.
I think those are both two really important questions. On the first one, I would say, my research into Amish communities has led me to understand that actually there are more parallels that I think we don't always realize, in that what Jews do in the separation of the 6 other days of the week with Shabbat, many Amish communities do not with time, but with space, in that the level of technological use is really about where you are. So church and school are places where you have as little technology as possible. Home, you have a little bit more, but also not so much. The workplace, you have lots and lots of technology. Often you have computers and phones and like basically anything that you would have in any non-Amish setting as well. And so I think both Jews and Amish are playing with that, in that they are actually using technology quite a bit, but only in specific settings. So for Amish, it's specific spaces. For Jews, it's specific times. But both of them are kind of have that, are dancing between those two. On the second, I would say, I think honestly, both for Jews and for Amish, there is a kind of narrative about centralized activity, which does not necessarily get played out in reality. In the long history of Jewish responses to technology, it is often the case that rabbis are last to the scene. Not always, but it is often the case. I would say the lag time has decreased rapidly in the 19th and the 20th century, and we're now at a place where rabbis are now looking ahead and saying like, well, we don't have, for example, lab-grown meat just yet, but let's speculate about what the reaction might be. I think actually the present moment where we're thinking about Zoom Seders, for example, is actually one of the moments where rabbis have had the most ability to respond and to kind of guide an attitude of a community before the community itself has had a chance to respond. Meaning like the rabbis actually have a particular amount of power in this particular moment. But I think often what happens both for Jews and for Amish people is that people start making decisions by themselves. Rabbis are trying to navigate between, on the one hand, guiding their communities, and on the other hand, not alienating community members by making decisions that are going against what many people in the community have already decided they're going to do anyways. And that's obviously an incredibly difficult thing to do. I think my suspicion is that what will happen around the Zoom Seders this year is that some people will do them and some people won't. And what will be gained in that is a sense of whether this was a good idea at all. And that is a healthy thing to happen, to have that wide variety of responses, and to then afterwards have a communal discussion about whether it was worthwhile.
If I could add just one more thing, it's funny what you say at the end about that is the variety that's out there. Rabbi Daniel Sperber says something very similar about tefillot and the idea that there are different places doing different things. You end up with that variety, and then we'll see how it's all going to shake out over time. Yeah, thanks.
Hello?
Sydney.
Yes, thank you for a very profound discussion, but I'd like to bring up a mundane example in which Shabbat created a technology. The slow cooker was invented by an American Jew to permit Jews to be able to make cholent over Shabbat without breaking Shabbat. It wasn't that Jews adapted the slow cooker. That was the purpose for which the slow cooker was actually invented.
All right, I think that's really useful because it suggests that Jewish responses to technology don't need to decide between existing options. You know, it's not just between A and B. You can actually invent a C and choose C. I think, you know, not just for Shabbat, but for other areas of Jewish law that are engaged with technology, that's really important in thinking about, you know, does a Jewish response mean doing what someone else is already doing? Or does it mean like inventing a new kind of browsing experience, inventing a new app, inventing like new restrictions that are really specific to Jewish communities, which may end up getting adopted like the slow cooker, but other people, once they realize they're actually really good ideas.
Hello, this is
Yeah.
Paul Dermont. So when you mentioned gimmicky workarounds, the first thing I thought of was the Eruv. And so my question is, when was the Eruv developed and what was the driving force for it?
So the Eruv is very complicated. It develops, it's a rabbinic invention as a kind of as a large scale workaround to allow communities to communicate, to carry things from domain to domain. But I would say that the useful technological connection there is that, and just to explain, so an Eruv is a boundary that that is built around a given community that is supposed to, it's a kind of legal fiction for a series of doorways. And by producing that legal fiction, it allows people to carry items in public settings where they would not normally have been able to carry items, which is often a very useful thing if you're trying to, you know, bring a dish to somewhere else or bring a child to shul or things like that. You know, where there really is a major shift in what it means to construct an Eruv comes around in the early 19th century with the invention of the telegraph. So something I've been doing research on is the ways in which telegraph construction spurs this new conversation in what it means to have an Eruv, right? Because previously, Eruvim were constructed around where Jews already lived, right? So you build some kind of thin boundary around that area of settlement. It just so happened that fit the legal qualifications, or almost fit the legal qualifications needed to have an Eruv. And so there are immediately questions about whether this arbitrary line extending from point A to point B, which was somewhere near my Jewish community, whether that can be incorporated into an Eruv. And so there's a really big shift because the Eruv goes from being something which is constructed specifically around a defined community to something which itself defines a community, right? Like in nowadays, building an Eruv plays a major role in where people end up living. And so the Eruv is actually the defining thing, in part because it is so much easier to build an Eruv, especially in America, where very few wires are buried underground. So basically, you can pick any street in most American cities and decide that I want to have an Eruv run along that street. And so that produces a kind of major shift. I just want to go to the people have been asking some questions in the chat, so I want to respond to those. Clara asked, do you think it's skepticism or thousands of years of Jewish legal interpretation that keeps halakha from allowing technologies from being used on Shabbat? So I think it's more complicated than that. I don't think it's about a kind of blanket disinterest in using new technologies. But I think there's a kind of caution. I think, you know, religious communities often are cautious about various things, and Jews around Shabbat have learned to be cautious around new technologies. And that is in part based on the fact that Shabbat law is very complicated in itself, and partially out of the learned experience of what it means to observe Shabbat. Miriam asked, who wrote the laws after the Industrial Revolution? Who decided and how? So I think, you know, in terms of rabbinic laws, if I understand your question, there is no formal change to the ways in which laws are decided beforehand, but there's just more things being thrown at the rabbis. In fact, like there's some rabbis who in the 19th century are already complaining, my job is so much harder than the jobs of my ancestors, because my rabbinic ancestors, because, you know, I have all these new technologies that I have to rule on, and this is so complicated trying to figure out, you know, every time a new technology comes about, I have to dig through all my old books to figure out what in this is relevant to the new technology. So the technology really makes up a pretty significant portion of development in Jewish law today, like meaning like what is actually discussed in new legal books in ways that had not previously been the case.
Okay, thank you, David C. I think we have one more question maybe, and then we're gonna wrap it up. Lewis has a question. Do you want to ask it or do you want me to read it? Do you want to unmute? I'll just read it. He says, as technology becomes more invasive, it may become impossible to avoid the Internet of Things.
There's certainly going to be a point where choosing not to interact with technology, I think specifically electricity, which is often what we mean when we say technology, we actually mean electrical devices or computers. There may be a point where it's impossible to not interact with those. You know, like I think one example that has already come up is if you're in a hotel on Shabbat, in many cases, there's no way to enter your room without using an electric key at this point. What I think will probably happen is the prohibition on using electricity on Shabbat, which has been around for around 100 years, and I think has been really well received, and I think frankly was a really good idea, will become more flexible. Electricity, because it is so pervasive, may no longer feel like the separation between Shabbat and the rest of the week, and instead specific categories of electrical devices will retain that status. So for example, I think even within the domain of electrical devices, there is a special anxiety around communications devices, right? Around phones, around televisions, around smartphones, probably most of all, as the thing within those, as the kind of subset of electrical devices that really feels like entering the world of the other 6 days. So I suspect that we'll see more flexibility from rabbis of all denominations on questions of electricity, but at the same time, we may see a kind of doubling down or a kind of spelling out of which devices within that domain are really problematic and why. And so there may be a kind of reconfiguration there in the same way that, you know, honestly, in the same way that the Amish have also done the same thing recently, where electricity used to be this major dividing line, and now it's not electricity itself, it's kind of specific modes of electricity, specific kinds of electrical devices.
Great, thank you so much, David C. And thank you, Limud, for co-partnering and helping to make this happen. I'm getting one message that, oh, was it Rabbi Rubenstein? You have a copy of a Haggadah, of the Afula Haggadah, because I mentioned Print-O-Matic at the beginning. So I don't know if you want to show that or hold it up again. Give a little plug there.
Actually, I do have 2 of them, but what I was holding up was actually this one, the Pirkei Avot, which is really fun,
Nice.
fun and very cool.
If anybody's looking for reading over Pesach, we are shipping books very quickly, which I know not everybody is.
Right. So maybe you'll have some more reading and time on your hands this Pesach, since we don't have anywhere to go exactly. So again, thank you so much, everyone, for joining. And David C., thank you so much for taking the time to do this teaching and learning with us. And Limud, November 1st. Yes, we're going to aim for that date. And everyone, please be well and be healthy and be safe and take care of each other and take care of yourselves. And have a wonderful evening. And thank you so much.
Thanks
Rebecca.
Thank you.